The most infamous version involved forcing a victim onto a large, rounded, and often oiled stake, which was then raised upright. The person's own weight would slowly drive the pole up through their body, a process that was deliberately designed to miss vital organs and prolong the agony for hours or even days. The pillory was a device used for public punishment, focused more on humiliation than on physical harm. It consisted of a wooden frame with holes for an offender's head and hands, which officials would lock in place. The victim would be restrained, usually in stocks, with their bare feet exposed and covered in salt water. Then, a thirsty goat would be brought in to lick the salt off. The ducking stool was a tool for public humiliation, aimed almost exclusively at women considered gossips or scolds. It was basically a chair attached to the end of a long wooden beam that worked like a giant seesaw. The method involves restraining a person and allowing cold water to slowly and methodically drip onto a single spot on their forehead. While seemingly harmless, the relentless, repetitive sensation over a long period becomes maddening. The Swedish drink was used during the 30 Years' War to force peasants to reveal hidden valuables. Soldiers would restrain a victim and force them to swallow enormous quantities of a vile liquid, often a foul cocktail of manure, urine, and dirty water. This is a truly horrifying one, straight out of ancient Greece. The brazen bull was a life-sized, hollow statue of a bull made entirely of bronze, with a door on the side. You'd lock a victim inside, light a fire underneath, and essentially roast them to death. Also known as death by 1,000 cuts. The executioner would tie the condemned person to a wooden frame and slowly slice off bits of their flesh over a long period. The whole point was to maximize the suffering and keep the person alive for as long as possible as a public spectacle. The gas chamber executes a person by sealing them in an airtight room and flooding it with poisonous gas. Typically, this is done by dropping cyanide pellets into a pan of sulfuric acid, which creates deadly hydrogen cyanide gas. Known as peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment, this method was a legal procedure used to force a defendant to enter a plea. Officials would lay the accused person on the ground, place a heavy board on their chest, and then progressively pile weights on top of it. barrel of shame, or shanmantle, was a punishment for minor social crimes like public drunkenness or cheating at cards. Officials would force an offender into a large, heavy wooden barrel, often with no bottom, making them awkwardly waddle through the streets. Sawing was a horrific method where a victim was literally sawn in half. In the most common version, the person was hung upside down with their legs spread apart so the executioners could start sawing from the groin. The breaking wheel. Executioners would tie the condemned person's limbs across the spokes of a large wooden wheel. They then used a heavy iron bar to systematically shatter the person's bones between the gaps. The thumbscrew was a straightforward but brutal device used for interrogation. It was essentially a small vise with two plates that an interrogator would place around a victim's thumb, finger, or sometimes even a toe. The head crusher does exactly what its name suggests. The device was a metal frame where the victim's head was placed, with a chin rest below and a tightening screw and cap above. Think of the Chinese Kang as a portable, personal version of the pillory. This was a heavy wooden board locked around an offender's neck, and often their wrists, which they were forced to wear for weeks or even months. The garrote was a device used to execute people by strangling them, most famously in Spain. The condemned person was seated in a chair while the executioner fitted a metal collar around their neck. The guillotine is the infamous decapitation machine that became a symbol of the French Revolution. It consists of a tall, upright frame with a heavy, angled blade suspended at the top. The Judas cradle was a sadistic device designed for prolonged pain and humiliation. It consisted of a pyramid-shaped seat perched on top of a wooden stool. The heretic's fork was a simple but cruel tool designed for sleep deprivation and pain. It was essentially a metal rod with two sharp, fork-like prongs on each end. Unlike a typical sword meant for combat, the executioner's sword was a specialized tool built for one job: beheading. It was a large, heavy, two-handed weapon, often with a squared-off or rounded tip instead of a sharp point, since stabbing was never its function. The Pear of Anguish was a truly nasty device, supposedly used for punishing specific crimes. It was a metal, pear-shaped instrument made of several segments that an interrogator could slowly expand by turning a key. Developed in the United States as a supposedly more humane alternative to hanging, the electric chair is a method of capital punishment. Officials strap the condemned person into a specially built wooden chair and attach electrodes to their head and leg. Instead of stretching the body, it was designed to compress it with excruciating force. The victim was forced into a crouching position and locked into an A-shaped metal frame. As the frame was tightened, it would crush the person's body inwards, dislocating the spine, shattering the ribs. Death by boiling was an especially gruesome public method used for crimes like poisoning. The condemned person would be stripped naked and placed into a large cauldron filled with water, oil, or even molten lead. Burning at the stake is one of history's most infamous methods, reserved mostly for those accused of heresy and witchcraft. Executioners would tie the condemned person to a large wooden post, then pile wood and flammable materials around their feet. The zanji was a brutally simple finger-crushing device from China. It consisted of several small sticks tied together with cord, with a person's fingers placed in between them. Riding the rail was a brutal form of mob justice, popular in early America for punishing people who broke social or political rules. A crowd would force the victim to straddle a sharp wooden fence rail. The gallows is used for hanging criminals for centuries. It's essentially a wooden frame with a crossbeam, but its key feature became the trapdoor. A firing squad is most often associated with the military. The condemned person is typically tied to a post or stood against a wall, and a group of soldiers fires simultaneously at their heart. The Iron Maiden is a legendary, coffin-like cabinet lined with spikes, and it's probably more myth than reality. The idea was that a victim would be forced inside, and as the doors were closed, long spikes would pierce them from all directions. The boot was a brutal device designed to crush a person's leg and foot, primarily used during interrogations. There were a few versions, but the most common involved either a metal casing that was slowly tightened around the leg like a vise, or a wooden box where wedges were hammered in to increase the pressure. The body of a criminal, often a pirate, murderer, or traitor, will be placed inside a custom-fit, human-shaped iron cage called gibbet. This cage was then hung from a gallows in a public place, like a crossroads or harbor entrance. The wooden horse, also known as the Spanish donkey, was a painfully simple and brutal. The wooden horse, also known as the Spanish donkey, was a painfully simple and brutal. Flagellation, or whipping, is one of the oldest and most widespread forms of punishment. The whips themselves could be anything from a simple leather strip to the infamous cat on 9 tails, a multi-tailed whip often knotted or embedded with bits of metal or bone specifically designed to tear the flesh. The rack is one of the most infamous devices, designed to dislocate every joint in a person's body. The victim was laid on a rectangular wooden frame with their hands and feet tied to rollers at each end. Strappado was a common and used a simple pulley system. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and the rope was slung over a beam or pulley. The scold's bridle, or brank, was a nasty tool for public humiliation, aimed almost exclusively at women accused of gossiping or nagging. It was an iron cage locked onto the head, but its cruelest feature was a metal bit plate, sometimes spiked, that was forced into the mouth to press down on the tongue. The lethal injection table is the modern gurney used for capital punishment, most notably in the United States. Officials strap the condemned person to the table, often with their arms extended to keep them completely still.